So in this panel, I get to also be moderator as well as the MC. So I'm going to, and we're going to make this more of a discussion on your program. You'll see that we've had a couple player changes. Denis, unfortunately, could not make it to bring the European perspective. I'll try to put a little bit of that in. He had a family health emergency that prevented him from being here. But we are thrilled to have Brian Alexander here, who's working in glioblastoma at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and doing some very innovative platform work there. And we have Diane Simeon here from PANCAN and pancreatic cancer, which is a new emerging platform, which we'll talk more about. And I got to moderate this one because with a number of other people, including Laura Esserman and a number of people like Bob Beckman, who's in the audience, and John Louie, and a number of others, wrote a paper called Pipelines, How You Connect Platforms into a Better Learning System Over Time. So we'll be talking about some of the learnings from that paper as well, and those efforts. So Brian, could you lead us off a bit with a quick opening about yourself, your background, and maybe a little bit about your platform?
Great, yeah. So thanks to you and Gigi for inviting me to speak today. I want to kind of go over a little bit of GBM Agile experience. I'm a radiation oncologist at Dana-Farber. The GBM Agile kind of trial, and I say like, I think the goal of the GBM Agile community that came together was never really with the goal of doing a platform trial necessarily. It really arose out of a set of think tanks that Ann Barker put together, really trying to solve problems that were kind of common in the GBM community globally. To say, what are the kinds of frustrations that everyone shares? Why aren't things, we got a lot of information on this tumor, and I'm sure Ann will share later that, when she started TCGA and GBM was kind of the first tumor that was being characterized, we expected more progress to be made with the results of that information. And so I think kind of this global community were frustrated enough to say, let's come together and define the problems and really try to articulate solutions to those problems. And so I don't think Ann really had much trouble getting people to buy in, but it's remarkable how many people from around the globe came together in Arizona in a series of meetings to kind of really think about how we should do things differently in GBM. So from my perspective, there was a few kind of things, and I'll kind of frame it from both the clinical practice side of things and the R&D side of things, since I think that was a useful framework that came up earlier. From the clinical practice side of things, as a kind of practicing physician who sees patients with GBM, for those of you who don't know, it's a deadly disease, very bad outcomes, not great treatment options, and the standard of care is kind of silly that we call it a standard of care. So, coming up with something new seems like it should be part of our daily clinical practice, kind of just giving radiation temozolomide and just saying, looking at the disappointment that a patient has when you, explain what that can result in. It's kind of disheartening over and over. So to me, clinical practice should have definitely incorporated trials or new experimental therapies. And there were plenty of times where I'd see patients that there wouldn't be a trial available. And a lot of that is because of the inefficiencies of how long it takes to get a trial together, talk to all the groups that need to be talked to, arrange everyone's schedules, come up with an idea, vet that idea through 18 committees, go through IRB and all those kind of things, and then you enroll 100 patients amongst 18 centers and then it closes. And then you start the whole process over again. So there seemed to be a tremendous amount of inefficiencies to really answer the same question over and over and over again is a new therapy going to prolong survival or improve kind of patient-reported outcomes more than the standard of care? I mean, see, why are we reinventing the wheel? And then from the R&D side of things, when you look at drug development for GBM over the past 10 years, you see, probably 15 phase 3 trials being done, one of them that can be kind of claimed as positive. So hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients being enrolled on these negative trials, spending millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. And why are we getting that far? And what are the kind of design elements that we need to readdress? And so what we kind of, I think through this series of meetings, came to understand was that a lot of drugs aren't being developed specifically for GBM, so that when they kind of get to the point of after phase 1 testing and GBM seems like an indication, there's this kind of scramble to put together key opinion leaders and what kind of trial should we do, put that together, and like a lot of work goes into that, a lot of time goes into that. So we thought, well, why don't we just create the solution? There's the best kind of phase 2, 3 development for GBM, do that amongst ourselves in parallel with everything that's going on so that 5 years from now, no company will really think, well, how should I develop this drug in GBM? They'll just pick up the phone and call GBM Agile and say, here's the knowable timeline from now if we sign a contract to when the first patient's in, here's the estimated time to completion, here's how much it'll cost. And with all those kind of knowable timelines and expenses, then people can plan better. It lowers the bar for people wanting to develop drugs in GBM. It creates this environment where we're learning a lot from every patient that comes in and making it more attractive for people to want to develop drugs. So, I'm sure that we can go into like a lot of the technical aspects of GBM Agile and it being a kind of a phase 2, 3 design where you learn in a Bayesian adaptively randomized stage 1 and then confirm in the second stage to support registration of the drug, and how we kind of develop that without any specific drugs on the trial in kind of discussions with FDA and tweaking things over time. But really, it's really this community coming together and saying, the way we've done things isn't the way we should be doing things, and what can we do to change it?
Excellent, Brian. Diane, could you give us something similar about PANCAN?
Sure. So I actually don't work for PANCAN. I'm an academic, and I agree with everything Janet said earlier about all the flaws that are currently in place in academia, incentivizing how we do clinical trials. But I'm a surgeon, scientist, and I was at University of Michigan for a long time. I just moved to NYU. But I have been part of the PANCAN, or Pancreatic Cancer Action Network community. When I started working on pancreatic cancer in the mid-90s and then got my first NIH grant, I was one of about 12 people in the country that was funded to work on pancreatic cancer. It was a pretty lonely space. Over time, the research community has built. In fact, about a year ago, I went to a basic science meeting, about 600, 700 basic and translational researchers working on pancreatic cancer. And as a scientist, there's a certain level of rigor and sophistication that you bring about your work. And as time went on, I joined the NCI Clinical Trial Task Force. And it became pretty clear that clinical trials were not being conducted as they needed to be done for us to move the needle for pancreatic cancer. And for those of you who might not be as familiar about pancreatic cancer, we have some of the same doom and gloom numbers as you have for GBM. Still a single-digit survival, 9%. The thing that's helping us a little bit is we're getting more visibility for pancreatic cancer. There was a paper that just came out that showed that if we don't change outcomes for pancreatic cancer, it's going to become the second leading cause of cancer death in the US. So now everybody's sitting up and saying, oh, maybe we should pay a little bit of attention to pancreatic cancer. The timing is right. And with all of this, and realizing the limitations of what we had in place, which were several. The most compelling science isn't being driven to clinical trial. The timeline is too long. Average time from a concept being put forth to initiating a trial, about 2 years. By that time, the science has evolved, but the clinical trial structure is so rigid, it's hard to evolve. We don't learn from patients. Pancreatic cancer is a tough one. The pancreas is hard to access. Getting tissue has not been routine. Getting biopsies has not been routine. Lots and lots of phase 3 clinical trials that have failed with no learning as part of the algorithm. And so we had a critical juncture about 2.5 years ago where we said, okay, this system is not working. We're never going to change the needle for pancreatic cancer. If we wipe the slate clean and build it from scratch, what does it look like? And so we set about defining what those tenets should be. One is we have to cooperate in a different way. I think the touchstone was the year before. There were 8 different single-agent PD-1 clinical trials, all very small scale, run at the same time at 8 different centers across the country. And that's just a complete waste of time and resources and not right for our patients. So novel model of cooperation. And so how do you get people to do things differently than they're used to? And a friend of mine gave me this book by Robert Axelrod. It was actually written in the 1980s called The Evolution of Cooperation, and I thought that there was the key. If the natural state is for everyone to compete against each other, that's how academia is set up. But in his book, what he puts forth is if you have repeated encounters with individuals over time, actually the winning formula is cooperation. So if we build something that is so powerful, people want to join it, and they lose out if they don't, that's the key. And so we were lucky that we had this incredible foundation nationally, the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, that actually had funded a lot of the researchers and already had a lot of trust within the community. And so that served as we approached them with the concept of building this out. And we really thought very hard about what it would look like. And in the end, we came up with the thought of building a platform trial. But I can tell you, not everybody was on board. And of course, we had discussions with others working on platform trials, and definitely want to acknowledge the incredible groundwork done with I-SPY 2 and Brian and Anna to show us how it could be done. Of course, our diseases are all a little bit different. Breast cancer is a 5-year survival rate of 90%. Pancreatic cancer is lower, higher, higher.
If you don't have little seeds, you do well.
Right. So or higher, right? Here we have. So we have, kind of some unique challenges for some of our different diseases. Some of the basic tenets: deep learning from every patient. We're going to mandate that every tumor gets annotated very comprehensively, not only before treatment, but during treatment. And that has to be the new standard. We knew that we need to have a pharma consortium. We have a hard time getting access to drugs. So that's an important part that we've built out that actually has been remarkable. So I think, we're kind of in the trenches building this out, but I think in part, a lot of important lessons get learned of how, by doing something like this, we can gain so much more for our patients.
Excellent. And so from our perspective at MIT and NewDig, we looked at a number of platform trials from I-SPY to some of yours as well, and many others. And I and a large team of, I acknowledge some, but also particularly Allison Ackerman-Schreier, who is over here, is one of the primary authors on this pipelines paper. Allison, you should take a bow, because everything good in the paper she wrote, everything not so good, you can blame me for all that. But Allison was really primary for that. And what we found was a lot of different groups struggling through many of the same issues and leveraging the same sorts of operational enablers on one side, which often didn't get much credit, but were really important. And then everybody loved to talk about the clinical trial designs. Were you doing an umbrella? Was it adaptive? Was it a basket trial? Should you call it an octopus trial or a basket trial, right? But everybody was really excited about all the new design nomenclature, which was critically important. But also these operational enablers of how do you do the standards for how do you screen everyone? How do you do the master trial protocols in a way that stays open and yet approvable by an IRB and really keeps things moving quickly? How do you do the data rollover, and how do you handle some of the safety committee sorts of early looks and keep it confidential in a way that doesn't then bias the administrator, the actual clinical trial practitioners through all this? And there were remarkable innovative mechanisms that were developed to allow these things to happen going forward. And we need a bunch more through all that, there's no doubt. But there's an incredible set of 3, 4, 5, 6 different operational enablers that then you can layer these designs on top of through all that, and even begin to link them so that the same infrastructure within a couple networks might be able to serve multiple of these platforms. Because now we're seeing the cacophony challenge of, well, I have a pancreatic platform. Does it work with the GBM platform if I'm sitting here as a drug developer, right? Is it going to be just as good, different? How do I think about all these? Going forward, do I have to treat them all very separately? So we saw these operational enablers, we saw these design innovations, but then importantly, as you heard Michael Cusimano talk about over lunch, we also saw that we had to solve this chicken and the egg problem, and there were some really powerful what Michael might call network things, but we just called positive spirals that were going forward, where if you got a number of these things working, all of a sudden you heard Laura talk about contract signing to first patient dosed 3 to 4 months compared to 6 months to a year, right? That you could enroll the entire trial and have the arm done within a year or 18 months, maybe even 9 months, compared to 2 to 3 years that we saw in many of the other traditional approaches. Costs also fall through all that. So then you say, well, but industry won't want to get involved because they're using all the same standard endpoints. You can't make it quite as tailored to your particular needs for your particular compound. So is that trade-off worth it going in? And the answer seems to be perhaps growing. Well, you can do your own, what we now call handcrafted trials, right, as opposed to a more platform trial. But the handcrafted trial, like all good craftsmanship, takes twice as long and costs twice as much. So if you want to get there late and expensive, keep on going the old way. But if you'd like to get there more comparably with others, these platforms may be getting to the point where they have enough scale and credibility to begin this positive spiral. And we think we're right at the cusp of that kind of huge network explosion and effect happening moving forward. But for that to happen, we need greater connectivity, I think, amongst the various thought leaders. And I know there are various groups that are beginning to come together. We hope at MIT to be able to be part of that, right? And with the LEAPS program, we're extending that not just into the registration stage, but how do you continue it into this learning environment after approval? So it's very important to get the regulatory packages right, but then how do you move forward into real world experience through all that, even if it's not real world evidence, but that real world experience sort of approach. So that's what we're about here. It's very exciting. But I'm curious from your experiences so far, and Diane, you're trying to launch one of these, right? And are you seeing some of these challenges in launch are extraordinarily daunting, or is it beginning to get easier? As we've heard Laura talk about what it took to get iSpy off the ground, or do you feel like you're standing on the shoulders of giants, or are you still like slogging through the mud and everybody looks at you cross-eyed? You said you've got these cultural challenges, right, within your community. How's it going?
It's going to happen. I think we have enough momentum, enough people on board. I mean, we have a number of clinical trial innovations built within it, including, one of the basic tenets we wanted to deliver to patients was be able to offer multiple clinical trial options during their journey, and very important for our patients. And it wasn't clear that can be done. And we've enlisted Don Barry, who obviously is the guru, and I know that there's discussions about doing this in other diseases, but we basically said we're not doing this unless we build that in. So first, the initial response was, I don't think we can do that, to, okay, let's try to figure out how. And that's where the power of the patient comes in, right? There is always a way to do it. It's just a matter of what kind of subtle political pressure can be put on these things. But we're scheduled to launch in July. We've tried to keep the lawyers out of the room as long as possible. I think a point made earlier, which was to make sure for the pharma that we have a champion at a high level for each of the companies. And actually the pharma part has been pretty remarkable. We have at least 16, almost every major pharma company is now at the table, and we have an interesting funding model, which maybe we can talk about a little bit
later.
Later. But we have companies saying, here's our portfolio, and tell us how to deploy it for pancreatic cancer. And so that's a whole new game. We also never thought we'd be sitting at the table with the leadership of FDA talking about pancreatic cancer. So that's, I think the empowering part has been pretty inspiring to all the clinicians and researchers involved.
I would just add, I definitely, to your initial question, I think we definitely stand on the shoulders of giant iSpy. I mean, it's made it way easier to have lots of conversations because you're not trying to convince somebody of something new. I mean, I think like up to academic investigators, this kind of like, no, you'll still have academic ownership over a specific arm thing. Okay, here's 2 New England Journal papers. It's just like easy to have that conversation. It's much easier because iSpy did it first. I think some of the issues we have are, some benefits and complications are related to GBM. I think we have more challenges talking to companies about working with GBM Agile, not because of the design, I think, but because of like, do they want to develop a drug in GBM? And the question is, can we get the efficiency so great that it doesn't make sense not to in some ways? And so, to your point about like the handcrafted trial, I think if you're maybe wanting to do some like 10-person pharmacodynamic endpoint trial, that's fine. But in the phase 2 space for GBM, handcrafted trials have led to single-arm phase 2 studies compared to historical controls that have made really bad go, no-go decisions. And we spent a lot of academic time looking at, like, what's the variability in trials outcome on all these endpoints? What's the variability amongst trial space in the general population? What's the likelihood that you're going to be able to find a signal if you run a single-arm study? And what we find is it's pretty much dominated by randomized studies. You should always pretty much do a randomized study, even in the phase 2 space in GBM, if you want to make any sense of anything. And so at that point, then, can you get any efficiencies from doing a platform trial? Well, of course. We heard from Janet before, the kind of conserved control arm. Can we have enough of a platform so that we can go to pharma and say, you're going to run a single-arm phase 2 study, we'll just do it in AGILE, and it's actually a randomized study now, but you just pay for your arm. And then you have an automatic control comparison. If the study ends up not going on to the second stage and being registered for approval, and there's maybe a signal there, you just don't know what the biomarker group is, well, there's a rich biomarker data set to learn as much as you can from it. Now, it's randomized data to learn from, or if there's a signal, you don't have to run this separate large phase 3 study, just confirmed quickly, because when we talked with FDA, and this took a big delay for when we were putting together the design, we kind of sat there and said, well, what if we have a survival signal in this Bayesian adaptively randomized design? Would you feel comfortable approving that? And if not, what can we do to enhance your comfort level so that we're both not stuck with like a survival signal and now we have to run a 500-person randomized phase 3 study in a disease that has no options? And it wasn't like a hard sell from an FDA standpoint. I mean, like, they wanted the same thing we wanted to, not to be in that situation, to get the best care to patients. So I think some of the specific design elements we made were, we're spending a lot of time to solve like how you do phase 2, 3 development. And the benefits of a platform trial and a master protocol are you're putting a lot of time and effort into this fixed upfront cost to be able to amortize it for indefinitely. And so you wouldn't do this for one trial that lasted 2 years. It's been a lot of time and effort. But if we keep adding arms and arms and arms and arms so that nobody really thinks about developing a drug in GBM anymore without doing it on the platform.
You've already built an engine.
You've already built the engine. So I would say a lot of the kind of the mud that we're in is more related to the disease, but there's some benefits to that as well in terms of how the trial runs. But absolutely stand on the shoulders of giants with iSpy.
Excellent. So Diane, as you're getting this thing moving forward, patient access, I mean, you talked about that a moment ago a bit, but maybe you could amplify that, because I think you're trying very hard to be strongly patient-driven.
So I think one of the benefits we have, again, is partnering with the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, and they've been in the business of advocating for pancreatic cancer patients for a long time. They get, tens of thousands of calls. They have a patient hotline, people all over the country with pancreatic cancer. There's not, uniform expertise. And so there's a 911, call PANCAN if you have a pancreatic cancer problem. So they have that reputation of being an honest broker to help patients. And so, and they have about 1 million, individuals around the country that have PANCAN as a touch point. So that has served as a fantastic fabric upon which to build this. And so since they have that reputation, and then we build in all the thought leaders in the field, clinical trial experts, research experts. We actually started out with research team saying, what's the science out there that we should drive to clinical trial? What's ready to go? And we went through and vetted the entire scientific literature out there, our arms committee, and drilled down to what we thought were the first set of arms. One important point we realized is if you really want to make a difference for disease, you need a continuum from the bench all the way to routine patient care. And so while we have started out with the phase 2, 3 seamless design, we recognize that we actually need to fill in with a phase 1B. And so that's our, there's what you start with and then what you build upon. And for anyone who hasn't read the Pipelines paper, I actually came to a platform meeting several months ago, and it was eye-opening for us, because we just had our heads down doing all this work, and we hadn't really thought we accomplished anything. And we showed up at this meeting, they're like, "Oh, you're doing well, or keep doing what you're doing." But while this is the hub of it, we can still be innovative. We recognize, for example, there are going to be subgroups of patients that might not work for the phase 2-3. They may have small percentage biomarker positivity that we have to be a little bit more creative. We're thinking about doing phase 1 in a different way, building a lot more science into the phase 1 than just looking at the safety signal. Having things flow into the arms that are just much more robust and have a higher likelihood of working. And also trying to train all of our scientists to think differently. Think about your work going towards clinical trial, build in biomarker work early. Instead of adding it all on at the end as part of a clinical trial where samples are collected and they all sit in a freezer somewhere and nothing really gets done with it. So I think just shifting thinking of the field, this has been a very useful exercise in doing that.
Excellent. So let's talk briefly about the third rail of lawyers and funding, right? And then after that depression, we'll come back up with your greatest hopes for where we're going, and we'll take some questions. But a brief touch on that point. Brian, you want to lead us off? So
Sure.
in intellectual property amongst all the various players and the lawyers, how are you doing? And the funding.
So again, I think a lot of the buy-in from a company thinking that they can develop their drug within a platform and then still kind of not compare it to other things directly and get their data back and compare to a control arm. Again, we have iSpy to point to as a function where that works. In terms of the funding, I think this is an open question. There's a lot of different models out there. Dan will talk a little bit about their subscription model. There's like the data, and if you're doing a lot of rich biomarker analysis, what's the data worth and to who? One thing is, if we're going to have if we want to have this as a registration trial and want to have real, high quality data that pharma feels and biotech feel comfortable with, we made the determination to work with a CRO, so it's not cheap. And then, so I think one of the initial conversations with companies is kind of setting the stage is like, we're not doing this as an IIT. This is like, this is a very, efficient way to do the phase 2-3 development that you may have otherwise been thinking of doing. You don't have to, hire, keep a whole team going. You have knowable timelines and burn rates for money and those kind of things.
You want money out of the real clinical development budget, not the academic relationships budget.
Right, because this is the way that drugs have been developed for GBM have been suboptimal, and just from a company standpoint. There's wasting lots of money doing it, and we think this is more efficient and a better way to do it and get better answers. So I think the initial discussions we've had with companies have been very positive, and I think when you first kind of go out there and you kind of pitch the whole thing about you're trying to you wait for the kind of like, well, how are they going to react to this? If it looks like it's an IIT and it's going to go through things, we just can't do it. So, but then when we get to that kind of the budget page and like with the costs of facing the companies, most companies have looked at us and said like, this is a third of the cost and half the time is what we would normally have projected, and it helps to have kind of our CRO partner with us at the table too, to say like, here are the trials that we've done in this space, and this is the cost that we've kind of bid out before, and it is like that. So then we're all talking the same language, and it's a little bit of a different conversation. So ultimately our model will rely on having kind of pharma participating in supporting the trial long term, and not from just like a subscription of like, and we give them back some data, but like paying real money to run an arm on the trial.
Yeah, because you're running real registration on.
We've also had people approach us, some like smaller companies and biotech, to say like, if you have knowable timelines and those kind of things, can you help us raise the money, and we'd be open to talking about licensing agreements of the drug, like some back-end kind of milestone payments or those kind of things. And I think we're open to all of those type issues. Again, we're very laser focused on getting the kind of it open and running in kind of the most simplified version as we can that still retains all of its platformness and like the innovations but we're open to all of those. And I think kind of that long-term perspective that we have to have now as a trial that we don't want to close, is that now you're creating like an entity in the kind of drug development ecosystem that is GBM focused. It's like, what are the drugs that we want to develop for GBM? How can we partner with people that are developing drugs for any indication to have the indication and the drug and like kind of develop them together? So we need to be more proactive. We need to think about different financing mechanisms and those kind of things. And I think because we have to decide to figure out how to stay kind of sustainable long term, like those are all on the table.
And I'm struck hearing you talk about it. You've gone from talking about individual promising assets to how do I want to approach GBM? You've really taken a full, I mean, you can see this change in thinking happening, that it's really becoming a disease platform, not just I'm thinking about individual agents or a particular set of combos.
Yeah, for sure, and that's how we think of the organization. So the way that we decided, so we didn't have PANCAN, we decided to start a standalone organization, a 501c3, to be the sponsor of the trial. And so as we think about who are the people to staff that up, we think of the organization as a drug development organization for GBM specifically, and on the kind of like trial design efficiencies, those kind of things. So we would prioritize having people work with us that had development experience rather than maybe like a standard foundation, which would that's based around fundraising or those kinds of things. We need to have the fundraising aspect too, because I think we're trying to support that initial build with philanthropy so that we can pass on those savings to the initial people in the study, the initial pharma and biotech in the study. But we have to have people with expertise in development in the organization as well.
Diane, your experience similar with the sort of legal, financial kinds of pieces, or very different?
So from a funding perspective, let me take a step back. I think one of the things everyone involved is learning is innovation happens at all levels, and innovation in the funding model is as important as innovation that happens in the lab. Again, we were lucky we had a foundation that was helping to champion this. They laid down $35 million as an initial commitment for the first 4 years. But it's not enough for us to do this to the scale and extent that we want. And so what we did is engage the pharmaceutical industry, and our thinking was, let's have a pay-to-play model where we create an environment where it's beneficial to them to participate, and they help fund building out the infrastructure. So what are we selling, if you will? We're selling being in the room and being on working groups and working with all the scientific and thought leaders in the field to really think about the disease, all the data that's out there, published and non-published. We've talked about the points of efficiency, decreased costs. Those are all selling points. And I thought the talk at lunch was very helpful to think about that network effect. So first the companies would trickle in one at a time, and we'd be courting them. The last ASCO GI, I think I sat in the lobby of a hotel the entire meeting, and we met with 18 different companies, but we leveraged. They're
now an official business development person.
Yeah, but we really try to leverage all the clinicians and experts in our field to help utilize all their connections to get people to the table. But now that we have, it's really paying off, and now that we have a couple companies on board, and there's a pay-to-play model where companies will pay a certain amount where they have a seat at the table, can participate in some of these working groups, and there's a tiered approach. There will also be access to data. We're working on developing this. There'll be all the preclinical or all the data from the patients before they enter in an arm. ARM owners will be able to access the data on treatment, and then of course there'll be all the data afterwards. And so if you look at it from the perspective of the data that will be collected, and this is starting out across 12 sites, but actually 45 centers applied for this, so you can see where it's going once we get our traction. That data set where every patient is annotated in great depth, tissue during treatment, tissue at relapse. We built a supportive care research underlay. How do we best take care of pain? How do we manage nutrition? How do we handle cachexia? And build that all, and that also helps pharma as far as managing patients on trial. So when you put all that together, you end up with something that is very valuable to our other stakeholders and brings them to the table.
Wow, all exciting stuff. We're going to break for questions in just a second, but I'd like each of you first to say the next big thing. You're already, you're barely getting going and launching and doing all these things, but yet we heard Janet today push us into more community doctors. I've heard some pharma companies say, this is great, but we run global trials, not just US trials. They need to go global. What do you think is the next big thing for either your group or the community larger?
Well, maybe, Brian started off global and we started out in the US, and maybe you can tell me pros and cons.
We're starting, I think we're starting with 35 sites in the US and 5 in Australia with China. We've had conversations with China and met with Chinese FDA already and have that kind of process in parallel. They'll come on board and we want to open globally. I think for us, again, I'm really focused on just, this is already complex.
Exactly.
so I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves.
But we're supposed to be catalyzing next generation.
Sure,
so I had to toss out the bomb, right?
So I'll take that operation hat up and think about as we talk about this kind of confluence of clinical practice and clinical research, GBM is a really interesting place to do this, because when we enroll patients on a trial, when they get diagnosed with GBM and they have a progression, if we can put them on another thing after progression, which is also, I know, what Precision Promise wants to do, now we're really capturing a lot of their entire journey. And with GBM kind of dominates their medical history. Like, a lot of the other things don't matter as much when it comes to GBM. So it's a pretty simplified environment to really create this learning environment. That's AGILE, LE is the learning environment portion of it. So, the other kind of innovation that we have with AGILE is that newly diagnosed and recurrent are the 2 major indications for GBM. That's where the separate trials are run there. We run those in the same trial, and we consider that a biomarker. And so by considering that a biomarker, if treatment effects are similar in both newly diagnosed and recurrent, it pools the power together and it becomes a more powerful trial. And then the drug can be kind of approved in both newly diagnosed and recurrent, so you're not actually doing 2 separate trials. So from an R&D perspective, you have that kind of that kind of component where your indication finding happens within AGILE as well. From a clinical practice standpoint, that now allows anybody that comes in the door with a diagnosis of GBM to be enrolled on AGILE. And so now, I could imagine a situation where AGILE opens up more sites, and now it really is a learning environment for patients with GBM. And so we're dictating, by protocol, how patients are getting their care, how often they're getting imaged, what happens when it looks like a progression, how do you change people to another therapy, learning as much as we can from every patient. It really is this kind of confluence of clinical research and clinical practice. And then, why don't we manage their care all together? We're already paying this a huge site per patient cost. Why don't we pay a little bit more and bundle things together or something like that? GBM, because it's kind of a very focused disease and we can capture their patient's kind of entire history, we have the opportunity to do a lot of those kinds of things and really create an optimal learning environment from everything. But again, I'm just going to start with baby steps, and then we can
But it's exciting to hear that sort of grand vision. Somewhere you get the last word, and then we'll take a couple questions.
Well, when I think about pancreatic cancer, obviously we have to make advances in 2 major areas. One is in therapeutics, and I know we're going to do that. And obviously, we want to make a pitch to perhaps we can be a LEAP project for your team, pancreas and brain,
That's
2
right.
tough ones.
Bidding will start in the poster session.
But really, to make advances, we're going to need to treat patients earlier, and I think we've learned a lot of incredible lessons in just what we've done so far. So if we're forward thinking, we leverage this platform we build and we think about early detection biomarkers, blood-based imaging, and even in a larger scale, we know there's a significant cohort of high-risk individuals out there. Can we think even more grandly about doing prevention clinical trials in people? So I think, from my perspective, really capture doing therapeutics more effectively, but trying to shift the bar towards earlier diagnosis. I think because right now, pancreatic cancer, 85% of patients present with advanced disease that is non-amenable to surgical resection. So while we're doing this, we also have to be thinking about earlier detection.
Great.
The other thing I wanted to add is when thinking of this kind of real world evidence, if we have kind of GBM AGILE open as a trial, is there an opportunity, and we're recently with FDA and ASCO talking about kind of real world evidence, real populations and those kind of things, having your trial specific components still running as a trial, but then maybe talking to some large health systems with integrated records or those kind of things and saying, well, what is a limited set of data we could collect from you? We would, for GBM patients could potentially just be the randomization engine, give, different drugs. And then are there how long they're on the drug, if a patient dies, when they die. Just with those 2 things, you get progression and death and you have diagnosis. doing a parallel study without the CRO, without like collection of meticulous data, and see like are treatment effect estimates similar with a very limited set of data in more real world evidence. I mean, it could really support that kind of approach. And if you got 90% concordance of the, what you were getting in this kind of EHR limited data kind of thing with the large, expensive trial, could you, a tenth the cost or half the cost of drug development because you've kind of shown that this other parallel system works. And we don't need a lot of data points really, and I think we probably generate too many data points, and I think FDA said that too.
Excellent. So let's have a couple questions. If you could, questions that are really sort of detailed operational, how did you do X? Why don't you save those for the breaks because they'll be around, but if you have any sort of broader strategic direction questions, we'll just take a couple because I'd like to get us closer back on time if we could. But any questions? Here we have one coming up.
Hi, Jennifer Graff, National Pharmaceutical Council. So first of all, congratulations. You guys made a huge leap forward. But thinking about what Gigi challenged us about earlier today is making 2 leaps to cross that chasm. So last week I was at a payer policy summit talking about how do we deal with real world evidence, and one of the large health plans talked about care pathways specific to oncology and what they're going to be doing to start putting out information to help inform and guide their providers and patients on persistence of treatment, cost of treatment, success. Have you had discussions with payers moving beyond the regulatory leap to the payer leap, and is there an opportunity to pull those two together?
So the short answer is no. This is complicated enough. But I think there's absolutely an opportunity, and I think that's what I alluded to a little bit when I was saying like why can we talk to big payers and like accept bundles or some kind of thing? We're already dictating the care for all the patients that are on the trial. So like what's additionally like who's better at saying, well, we're not going to pay 5 times as much for IMRT versus 3D radiation rather than like this 150 key opinion leaders that are associated with our trial. So maybe like sharing risk with kind of insurers and those kinds of things, especially in GBM when that GBM diagnosis now dominates all the spending after diagnosis. The other thing I think the platform trials do is create an opportunity, and this is what I would love to bring up with payers even in the short term before we got to get to that panacea, which is developing kind of biomarkers that restrict the use of therapies. Like there's no real incentives, and Ariel Stern's in the audience and wrote a nice paper about this, but there's no real incentives to develop biomarkers for that, right? So like therapies that are currently being used that either they're expensive themselves or the toxicity that's associated with their use is associated with lots of expense from hospitalizations and those kind of things. If you could develop a biomarker that just showed the 20% of patients who don't respond at all to those, like who's got the incentive in the healthcare system to develop that? I don't think really anybody, but if you have a platform trial that's ongoing, that now you can have that conversation with insurers and say, okay, like is this something we can develop? We will, really advocate for it being put in NCCN guidelines or whatever kind of regulation needs to happen to be able to back you up in like withholding, giving cytotoxic chemotherapy in people that aren't going to respond and those kind of things. So I think that these kind of ongoing structures enable those kind of conversations, but we haven't gotten into that yet.
Diane, and you? Have you had any payer
Yeah, we haven't
conversations?
either. I mean, obviously, by building this, now we're in a position to start to have those conversations. But I would say as a clinician, I'm always impressed by how little data we have to guide daily clinical care. And it's very frustrating. That, I think, is part of our mission. Even if you take the biomarker space, liquid biopsy, everyone has their own little thing, and none of it is validated. And so now, we're going to set a path of true validation of results, and I think it's going to be a welcome day.
Excellent. Bob, introduce yourself and ask your question.
Bob Beckman from Georgetown, and I had the privilege of working with Mark on the pipelines paper. When I did so, I asked the author group a question that I couldn't answer, and they couldn't answer it either, so I'm going to ask it again. Which is, so obviously, we all believe this is a good idea, and we're going to build systems that encompass big chunks of things, like all of GBM, not only the research, but also the clinical practice, for example. And like you said, we would control the data points collected, and when they're collected and when you stop and when you start, and get into the care of the patients. And the question that I asked is there something we want to leave out of the system so that some individual who is highly creative, even though we have brilliant people running these things, they won't have all the ideas, right? So where do we let this unanticipated development come in from an individual when we build these very large structures? Is that in phase 1 in basic research, or is there another parallel approach of pilot studies? I think we put pilot studies into the pipeline paper.
We did.
But the question is really, how do you balance the governance of these very large things with the need for some individual creativity, which has fueled so much of science throughout history?
Right. So first, let me thank Bob for assuming that platforms have taken over the world and have now pushed out all other players, and everything is done through a platform trial, which is so dominant. So thank you for your confidence that this is coming.
I was assuming they will, and there's no doubt about that in my mind.
All right, so given that we now rule the world, how are you going to leave it
my
open?
answer is going to not assume that and say that there's always going to be a situation where there's kind of creativity and there's not everything. And I agree, I don't think anything should necessarily be governed by one specific system. So it's this balance of like, what do you get from kind of systematically collecting information and understanding that information versus kind of homogenizing things. And so I think it's disease specific for GBM, and this is what I try to point out. In the phase 2-3 space, at least right now, there's kind of a right way to do things. And maybe that will evolve over time, and maybe someone will come up with a great imaging endpoint that is the treatment effect on this imaging endpoint is 100% correlated with treatment effect on survival. And that will change the game, and maybe that will happen outside of a platform trial. And those kind of things need to be developed. But right now, saying, well, yeah, this group should do a single-arm phase 2 study on PFS and compare to historical controls in a biomarker subset with a lot of variability on biomarker measurement.
Yeah, well, that's clearly wrong, yeah.
Right, and then make decisions about phase 3, okay, that's a knowable thing that's wrong, and why don't we systematize that and try to generate as much learning as possible? Ideally, I'd like to have the systems in place where we're systematically kind of generating information and learning those kind of things and allowing creativity within that so that we're not getting too fragmented. But there's certain things that I think, and the community needs to come together for its disease, is say what things are amenable to, maybe I don't want to get too far afield, but maybe this is insurance.
Shorten it up.
In insurance, insuring risk or something, you want a big pool, but you can have innovation on how you deliver care. And I was thinking about it the same way. There's certain things that are really broad spectrum things developing phase 2-3 space and kind of organizing between. Okay.
Thank you. Final question, Bob. We'll have Diane answer it, and we'll go from there.
Bob O'Neill, FDA.
Good, you're gonna
I'm wondering whether you guys have any lessons learned on how to train clinical investigators in a platform trial, because there's a whole deal that's on ICH E6, good clinical practice, that's just been updated about 3 months ago, and it's going to be updated again in the context of real-world data. And that sort of speaks to, if you were to push this baby down into the community, you have to train clinical investigators, even to the extent that you're updating the brochure very, very continuously. So do you have any thoughts about how you guys train investigators who go into this platform trial, and what's different about that training relative to the way it's already been done?
Diane.
I think I'm still amazed how just standard care doesn't infiltrate, as widely as it can. I think it's just messaging and continual efforts. There are always early adopters and later adopters, but I think showing the benefit of this approach will and making sure we continually get the message out there is going to be the key. One little point I wanted to make, and this kind of gets back to how do you get academia involved, is we really want to make sure that people's careers weren't harmed by being part of this, and so we basically said all the leads of the trials are going to be juniors. right? So that I think is an important part of it, is to try to engage, fellows and junior faculty and get them leadership opportunities, and that will help us, kind of get the message out.
Right. But it's, to your point, it takes
time.
an intentional, pre-planned
Yes.
effort,
Well-
not just assume it's going to happen and everybody knows.
Getting to the academic community,
Yeah.
and you know this too, that's a big issue. And NCATS is worried about training the next generation of clinical investigators.
Yeah.
And this seems to be the 62 CTSAs that need to be brought on board in
Good point.
a federated,
Yeah.
do it now rather than 2 years down the line. So somebody needs to take this on in a more...
Talk to the man in the corner over there, Dan Hanaway, on the TIN and the TIC, right? Trial Investigation Network and the Innovation Network for clinical trials. Well, I wasn't going to give the advertisement for us, but yes, we're involved in that too at New Dig. So that's wonderful. So we thank our panelists here, please, Brian and Diane. So you can go.